Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history, in this case in the post-war era and the 1950s. In previous lectures, we've talked about the prominence of the culture of consensus in the post-war years and the 1950s. In this lecture, we're going to examine a darker side of that insistence on consensus, the so-called Red Scare. The insistence on consensus in the post-war years and early 1950s did have a darker side. The age was obsessed with communism and with anything that looked or sounded or felt a little bit different from the norm. And from the late 1940s through the mid-50s, the nation was embroiled in the second Red Scare. In 1947, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, known as HUAC, launched a series of investigations against Hollywood. In October of 1947, as the investigations began, a number of Hollywood entertainers formed a committee for the First Amendment. Frank Sinatra asked, "Once they get the movies throttled, how long will it be before we're told what we can say and cannot say into a radio microphone? If you make a pitch on a nationwide network for a square deal for the underdog, will they call you a commie? Are they going to scare us into silence?" Still, many in Hollywood, particularly studio executives, supported the inquest and wanted to clean up their industry by removing any communist influences. In 1945, several thousand Hollywood workers had gone on strike, disrupting the industry and arousing suspicion of communism in their midst. Worse, in 1947, movie attendance began to decline and continued on a downward spiral through 1949. There were a number of different reasons for this decline, including things like the baby boom itself, as there were many young parents, and those out there who might be young parents understand you don't go out to the movies as much when you're caring for infants at home. There was also the rise of television, which presented another way of viewing for many Americans. And while television remained less influential in the late 1940s, by the 1950s, television was booming, as we will discuss in some future lectures. There were also a growing array of alternative amusement choices, one of the most popular being bowling. Automatic pin setters, air-conditioned venues created a prime environment in the bowling alley, and it was marketed as a family activity. Bowling became the most popular participant sport of the 1950s. Movie studios saw the battle against communism as one way to win back the American consumer. They blacklisted suspected communists and made a concerted effort to produce films that diminished themes of un-American class conflict. Some performers, like Sinatra, barely saved their careers. Sinatra's name surfaced repeatedly during the HUAC hearings. Between 1947 and 52, Sinatra lost radio and movie contracts, and he was dropped by his theatrical agency and record label. Only his great fortune in landing a role in the movie From Here to Eternity in 1953, for which he won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, saved his career and restored him to good graces. Numerous others in Hollywood were not so fortunate. Hundreds were blacklisted. Some writers used pseudonyms simply to keep working. Hollywood also released dozens of explicitly anti-communist films. This is partly in response to one of the questions asked by Richard Nixon, who was the lead investigator for HUAC, of Jack Warner in 1947. He asked, "How many anti-communist movies have you made?" Some of these films were little more than anti-communist propaganda. They had titles like The Red Menace and I Was a Communist for the FBI. Others handled the issue more subtly. The 1954 Oscar for Best Picture went to a film called On the Waterfront, which applauded informants at a time when many in Hollywood were being asked to name names. Another important cultural medium and the transformative industry of its era was television, which transformed the American countryside in similar ways to the railroad in the decades after the Civil War and radio in the 1920s. Television was introduced onto the scene at the 1939 New York World's Fair, where there was a dazzling exhibit displaying the television and all of its promise for the future. The war years put the development and marketing of television on hold to some extent. And by 1946, there were still only a few thousand televisions in the country. These early television sets were large, with very small screens, flickering, and of course limited programming. The post-war years, though, witnessed a boom in the sales and prominence of television. By 1948, televisions were selling at a rate of about 200,000 per month. And by 1956, about 20,000 televisions were sold every day. By 1959, almost 50 million homes, or 9 out of 10 in the country, included at least one television. Television thus grew up in the early years of the Cold War. Television showed the HUAC hearings on Hollywood and televised many of McCarthy's speeches. In 1947, an anti-communist group called the American Business Consultants established a weekly newsletter called Counterattack, the newsletter of fact to combat communism. It turned on the broadcasting industry, used distortion, rumor, and innuendo. It also published in 1950 Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television. This book argued that the Soviet Union was increasingly controlling American radio and television. It listed 151 writers, directors, and others who were part of this communist conspiracy. Many of those mentioned on the list lost their jobs, or at least some gigs, because of their association with communism. Television companies, which were driven by advertising revenue, and thus inexplicably tied to the public desires, had little choice but to respond to the calls to root out communism. This was not the age to take risks and air daring programming. Much of the television, and particularly advertising, of the 1950s was formulaic and simplistic. Polling showed that repetition and plain, simple messages supported the consensus. Ads were not intended to be funny or pleasant, but rather simply to drive home one simple point at a time. Perhaps the most potent example was an ad for Anacin aspirin, which was considered one of the least popular advertisements among American viewers who were polled. It showed a human skull, inside of which a hammer was rapping repeatedly throughout the ad. While not popular, it contributed to a threefold increase in sales within 18 months of the ad airing. Advertisements didn't want to rock the boat, but rather to reassert the familiar, to help reassure the viewer that the products would help them fit in. No one at this time wanted to feel outside the norm. One ad for Clairol hair coloring in 1955 made this point well. Does she or doesn't she? Hair color so natural, only her hairdresser knows for sure. With the rise of television, advertising revenue multiplied tenfold between 1949 and 1951 to $128 million per year. The growth of television also called for some means of governing the medium. In 1952, the networks adopted a television code. It banned obscenities, vulgarity, and sexual or violent excesses. This allowed for further loyalty testing and blacklisting of suspected communists. Within these constraints, 1950s television reaffirmed the American way of life. Particularly popular were game shows and quiz shows, which inevitably showed contestants receiving an assemblage of American-made goods and products as prizes. Also popular were police and spy shows such as Dragnet, and westerns like Gunsmoke. Each of these continued to reinforce the themes we discussed with movies. The wonders of American life, celebrating the common man and his impact. And with quiz shows, there was the opportunity for everyone, even the common man, to strike it rich. The hook for one of the most popular shows, the $64,000 question, was, we're trying to show the country that the little people are really very intelligent. Family situation comedies were also very popular and advanced hopeful, reassuring themes, the middle-class lifestyle, and traditional gender roles. Father Knows Best was one of the most popular and reminded that both the mother and the daughter were to maintain their place in the home rather than to go out into the workplace. Popular culture thus reinforced the consensus of the post-war era. Still, there were many exceptions to this rule. Entertainment itself had an attraction outside of any messages being sent. How consciously were many viewers absorbing the messages in their programming? Still more obvious, there was a powerful strain against the consensus in popular culture itself. Even as it reinforced themes of conformity, unanimity, and consensus, it contradicted them as well, as film noir, rock and roll, and other entertainment showed. It is to these and other examples of the counterculture in the 1950s that we turn in our next.